Have you ever wondered what secrets might lie beneath a regular garage in a quiet neighborhood? Imagine the old concrete floor suddenly making dull, rhythmic thuds, barely audible yet strangely consistent. Most would blame it on pipes or shifting ground. Others might shrug it off as rats, but sometimes the truth is buried deeper than anyone dares to imagine. It was the kind of quiet only small towns knew. Woodpine, nestled beneath the pine-covered ridges of Oregon, lived in a soft rhythm of coffee shop chatter, rusty pickup trucks, and children on bicycles squealing down gravel streets. Jacob Miller was a fixture of that rhythm, a 38-year-old mechanic with a broad jaw, calloused hands, and the kind of loyalty you didn't need to question. He owned Miller's Auto, a humble garage 2 blocks from Main Street, where he and his younger brother Daniel fixed everything from tractors to Trans Ams. Jacob had built a reputation not just for reliable work, but for being the guy who'd stay late to fix an old lady's Buick for free, or lend his jump cables to a neighbor stranded in snow. But lately, the shine in his blue eyes had dulled. He started showing up later, lever leader. He'd pause mid-sentence, distracted by something beyond the frame of the conversation. His wife, Claire, noticed it first. "Are you okay, Jake?" she'd ask over their usual Thursday night chili. He'd nod, but his fingers would keep twitching around the spoon, his eyes drifting toward the kitchen window, like he was waiting for something or someone. A week before everything changed, Jacob confided in her. He whispered it like a confession. "Claire, I think someone's been watching me, in the garage." She laughed at first. Woodpine wasn't the kind of place for paranoia. But Jacob's voice didn't match his words. It trembled. Time heard things. Tools shifted. The first were in cooking equipment. I brushed it off. Said maybe he was tired. Said maybe it was just stress from the bank meetings. Because yes, Jacob had dreams. He wanted to expand the shop, buy a second lot in Crescent Valley, start selling classic car restorations. That kind of move came with stress. Claire believed him. She kissed his temple that night and told him to sleep. He never came home again. It was a Friday morning. Claire left for her teaching job at 6:45, as always. Jacob kissed her goodbye and promised he'd drop off papers at the courthouse by noon. He even made a joke about the judge's mustache needing its own zip code. At 11:30, he was seen fueling up his Chevy at Donnie's Gas Mart, chatting with an old high school friend. By 1:00 p.m., he was gone. No voicemail, no goodbye note, no Chevy. Just vanished. Daniel was the first to alert the sheriff. He told them Jacob had mentioned taking a spontaneous trip to Montana. "He's been restless lately," Daniel said, voice heavy, eyes hollow. Said he needed air, said he might go fishing. He even had a story about Jacob calling him Thursday night to talk about it. The sheriff took it down, noted it wasn't unlike Jacob to taste adventure. Claire tried Jacob's pager, but there was silence. That night, Daniel drove Claire around, pretending to check motels and rest stops. He kept repeating, "Jake'll call. He always does." But days passed, then weeks. Claire filed a missing persons report. A flyer with Jacob's square jaw face was posted in every gas station from Woodpine to Salem, Mississippi. The cabin at the office, in the cabin beneath the cabin property, confirmed nothing. The cabbie never showed up. No credit cards were used. The man who'd fixed half the town's brakes was simply not there. Claire held onto the phone like it was a lifeline. The answering machine played Jacob's voice, cheerful, full of life. She played it again and again, hoping for a sign. But nothing came, and then, just as quietly as he disappeared, people began to move on. Woodpine wasn't cruel. It just had crops to harvest and babies to burp. People needed oil changes, and Daniel, loyal brother Daniel, kept Miller's Auto open. By spring, Daniel told everyone Jacob had likely settled out in Montana with an old Army buddy. He probably needed to reset. Jake was tired. Claire, though devastated, wanted to believe. Her hope began to bleed into resignation. At night, she stared at the front door, willing it to open. It never did. 6 months later, Jacob's name began to fade in town chatter. The world kept turning, but Walter Green, a new neighbor 2 houses down from Daniel's property, had just moved in. A retired Marine with a steel spine and curious nature. And from his porch, he had a clear view of the Miller garage. One night, sipping coffee under the cold starlight, he heard something, barely audible, like a metallic knock, a thump beneath cement. By the winter of 1993, the sharp sting of Jacob's disappearance had dulled into a slow, cold ache. Claire still sat two places at the dinner table out of habit, and the town of Woodpine had stopped whispering when she walked into the grocery store. Life moved on, with a heavy indifference that only time could afford, and then one morning a strange envelope slid through her mail slot. No return address, no postage mark, just her name written in slanted blue ink. Inside, a postcard. A photograph of a gas station in Amarillo, Texas. On the back, "Claire, it's beautiful out here, finally getting some peace. Tell Mom I'm okay. Love, Jay." Her hands trembled. She pressed the card to her chest, ran her fingers over the words. There was no date, no postal barcode, just ink, card, and confusion. She called Daniel immediately. He drove over within minutes, read the card slowly, face unreadable. He said finally, "Maybe he's really out there. Maybe he just doesn't want to be found yet." Claire asked if it looked like Jacob's handwriting. Daniel nodded too quickly, too firmly. "Of course it is." The next month brought another card, this time from a roadside diner in Nevada. "Been sleeping under stars some nights. Miss the garage smell. Hope you're well." No postal mark, nowhere on the card. It looked like someone had just placed it gently in her mailbox. Claire began to wait by the door every afternoon, checking the box obsessively. A third card came from Helena, Montana, then one from Boise, Idaho. The words were warm, brief, eerily similar. Each signed J. Each filled her with a flicker of hope and a storm of unease. Why didn't he call? Why no date? Why did the handwriting feel slightly off? A week before Christmas, she showed the cards to Ruthie Sanders, a retired schoolteacher and longtime friend of the Miller family. Ruthie had taught both Jacob and Daniel in 5th grade and had a sharp memory for details. She adjusted her glasses, peered closely at the loops and angles in the handwriting. Then she pulled out an old receipt she kept, some sentimental trinket from Miller's Auto when Jacob had fixed her radiator 10 years ago. Claire watched as Ruthie held the two papers side by side. The silence stretched. Finally, Ruthie whispered, "Claire, this isn't Jacob's writing. This looks exactly like Daniel's." Claire stared at her. "That's impossible," Daniel said, but even as the words left her lips, memories began to rearrange themselves. Daniel, insisting Jacob was fine. Daniel, always the first to intercept concern. Daniel, never showing surprise at the postcard. Claire asked if Ruthie was sure. Ruthie nodded, her finger tracing a specific curve on the letter J, a flourish Daniel always added, like a signature tick. "And look at the way the T crosses," she murmured. "Jacob always kept it short, straight. These loop upward. That's Daniel." Claire took the cards home and laid them out across the kitchen table. She compared them to birthday notes Jacob had once written, love letters from years past. Her pulse quickened. The differences, subtle at first, were now screaming at her. The cards had too much order, too little soul. Jacob had a messier hand, like he wrote mid-thought. These were careful, practiced. That night she couldn't sleep. Her thoughts were caught in a loop, Jacob's disappearances, Daniel's unwavering narrative, the absence of real mail markings. She remembered the first card, the lack of even a stamp. Who delivers mail with no postmark? Why didn't she question it sooner? By the end of December, Claire took the cards to Sheriff Monroe. He was aging now, semi-retired, but still respected in town. He read them quietly, rubbed his chin, and said, "There's no proof these came through official postal channels. No ink stamp, no wear on the edges. Either someone's mailing them directly into your box or leaving them by hand." Claire didn't want to believe it, but she knew what he was implying. She asked Monroe if he could discreetly look into it. He agreed. He kept it quiet, promising to ask around about Jacob's last days. Any new leads? Claire didn't tell Daniel. She wanted to. She ached to. But something had changed. Her trust had cracked, and she wasn't sure what lay beneath. The next postcard came in mid-January, this time from somewhere in Utah. It read, "Saw a coyote today. Made me think of Dad. He'd laugh at that. Stay safe." Claire's hands shook as she slid it into an evidence bag she'd bought at a hardware store. She didn't cry this time. She was done hoping. Ruthie called one afternoon, her voice tight. "Claire, I found something." In her attic, tucked in a box of tax records, was another receipt from Miller's Auto, dated 1989. The handwriting on it was nearly identical to the postcards. Ruthie swore Jacob never wrote receipts. It was always Daniel who handled the books. Claire drove over, heart pounding, and held the documents side by side. They matched. That evening, Claire parked her car down the block from Daniel's house. From her vantage point, she could see the side of his garage, the sloped roof covered in frost. Lights glowed behind the small window. His tool room, he called it. She remembered how, months ago, he refused to let their cousin borrow a wrench. Too many break-ins, he'd said. But Woodpine hadn't seen a burglary in years. Her thoughts were interrupted by headlights. Walter Green, the neighbor, pulled into his driveway. He paused, stepped out, and walked toward her. Claire stiffened. He tapped her window gently. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked. She nodded, unsure what to say. He looked toward Daniel's garage. "Strange thing," he muttered, eyes narrowing. "Thought I heard something last night. Sounded like tapping. Faint but regular, like a hammer. Or something trying to get out." Claire's breath caught. Walter didn't notice. He tipped his hat, wished her good night, and walked inside. Claire sat there long after his door closed, staring at Daniel's garage, her pulse echoing in her ears. The following week brought a biting cold wind to Woodpine, the kind that stung the skin and made every errand feel heavier than usual. Claire, still shaken from her late-night exchange with Walter, found herself lingering in her car across from Miller's Auto more than she cared to admit. The garage, Jacob's old pride, still bore the fading blue and gold sign, but the way it stood now, under Daniel's hand, felt like a shadow of its former self. One afternoon, as she waited to pick up dry cleaning from a nearby shop, she overheard a conversation that made her heart catch. An older man, probably in his 60s, was grumbling to the clerk. "Been coming to Miller's since '85, he said, "but it's not the same. Used to be Jacob running the place, now it's his brother, and he won't even open the back end of the garage. Had to fix my muffler in the front bay, like some kind of drive." Claire stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir?" she said gently. "Do you mean the back section with the red steel door?" The man nodded, cheerful. "That's the one, always locked. I asked once if he could pull my truck in there. It was raining hard, but he said it was under renovation. Thing is, that door's been under renovation since Jacob vanished." Claire forced a polite smile and thanked him, her thoughts racing. She remembered the layout of the garage well. That back area had been Jacob's workspace, a sort of mini-office and parts storage, but it had never needed major repairs. 2 days later, Claire arranged a casual visit to the garage, pretending her car was acting up. Daniel greeted her with his usual charm, if slightly forced, and offered to take a look. "Probably just a belt," he muttered, popping the hood. Claire wandered inside, pretending to admire the vintage signs on the wall, while noting how tightly packed the front area was, boxes stacked awkwardly, tools jumbled on carts. The air smelled of oil and steel, but also something mustier, more stale. When she glanced toward the red steel door at the back, her eyes caught the chain looped through the handle, secured with a thick padlock. She took a step closer. Daniel called out, "Can't go back there. Claire, got old plumbing work torn up. It's not safe." His voice was too quick, too rehearsed. Claire nodded, backing away, but her mind refused to rest. A few nights later, she met with Tyler James, a college student who'd worked part-time at the garage last summer. She offered to buy him coffee, and under the warm hum of the diner lights, she broached the subject gently. "Did you ever notice anything odd in the back section?" Tyler looked uneasy. He sipped his coffee, then finally said, "Yeah, once or twice. Not like ghosts or anything, just noises. I was restocking filters late one evening, and I heard this banging sound, like metal hitting a wall. Not tools dropping, more rhythmic. Repeated." Claire's throat tightened. "Did you tell Daniel?" "Sure did," Tyler nodded. "He said it was the water lines rattling. Old pipes and all, but I grew up around plumbing. My uncle's in the business. That wasn't pipes. Pipes don't slam like fists." Claire leaned in. "Did you ever go into the back area?" Tyler shook his head. "He keeps it locked, always, even when the rest of us are cleaning. He says he stores sensitive equipment there. I didn't think much of it then, but now, after hearing about those postcards..." His voice trailed off. "Do you think Jacob's in there?" Claire couldn't answer. She didn't know what to believe, but her gut, her mother's instinct, was screaming louder than ever before. Back at home, she dug through old records and found a photo taken in 1991, Jacob and Daniel standing in front of the garage, arms around each other, grinning. In the background, the red door was open. She could see the shadows of tires stacked high, a small desk, a fridge. There had been no need for secrecy then. What had changed? Later that night, Claire drove past the garage again. The lights were on. She parked 2 streets down and walked quietly to the side alley. From there she could see the back window, but cracked at the corner. She strained to listen. Silence. Then just as she turned to leave, a dull thud. And again, 3 times. Rhythmic, deliberate, not mechanical, human. Nothing moved. She waited 10 minutes, then walked home in silence, her hands balled into fists. Claire had started sleeping less, her dreams tangled with the sound of metal echoing in concrete hollows. The image of the red steel door haunted her waking hours, and Tyler's testimony looped endlessly in her mind. Daniel, once so present at family dinners and neighborhood cookouts, had turned into a shadow. She noticed it first during Aunt Lydia's retirement party, when his chair remained empty despite the invitation mailed and confirmed, then again at Caleb's graduation. No Daniel, no explanation. People asked, murmured, speculated, but no one questioned him directly. Claire began to see a pattern. Daniel was removing himself from gatherings, inching further into solitude, and no one seemed to notice or push. Even their family group chat, once bustling with updates, jokes, and occasional arguments, hadn't seen a reply from him in weeks. Claire messaged him about Thanksgiving plans. No response. She emailed, left a voicemail, silence. She checked his last activity on social media. The profile remained, but there hadn't been a post or like in months. What disturbed her more was that no one seemed alarmed. "He's just private," her cousin Mark shrugged. "Always had a streak of loner in him." But Claire remembered a different Daniel, laughing, loud, always ready with a story and the first to refill drinks. The change hadn't happened overnight. It had crept in, quiet and slow, like mold on a forgotten wall. Claire realized she had no idea what Daniel did outside of the garage now. Did he still see friends, go out? The man who once dominated trivia night at Sullivan's Pub now moved like a ghost through Woodpine. Meanwhile, across the street from Miller's Auto, a man named Walter Green had recently moved into a modest one-story house with faded green shutters and an American flag swaying lazily in the breeze. Walter was a Vietnam veteran, widowed for 5 years, who filled his days with routine and his nights with long, observant silences. He kept a journal of daily neighborhood activities, a habit he'd picked up long ago, not out of paranoia, but discipline. On his porch, with a thermos of black coffee, he noted patterns, timing, faces, sounds. He wasn't intrusive, just aware. It didn't take long for Walter to grow curious about the activity across the street. Miller's Auto, as he'd heard, was a family-run shop, neat signage, decent reputation, but what struck Walter was how often the lights flicked on after midnight. Once, twice, then again. By the 3rd week, he'd charted it. Daniel's truck would pull in at approximately 12:40 a.m. every other night, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, never regular, but always after the town had gone quiet. Walter watched through a slit in the curtain. The truck would idle for a minute, then shut off. Daniel would step out, glance up and down the street, unlock the garage, and disappear inside. The light would click on moments later. No sound, no movement. Then, anywhere between 30 minutes to an hour later, Daniel would reemerge, lock up, and drive off without headlights until he turned the corner. Walter didn't mention this to anyone. He wasn't one for gossip. But he wrote it down. October 17, 12:41 a.m., Daniel enters garage. Alone. Stays 54 minutes. Leaves quiet. Then again. October 19, 12:33 a.m. Entry confirmed. No signs of other persons. Exits 1:20 a.m. What gnawed at him was the lack of purpose. Mechanics didn't work at midnight. Inventory didn't require stealth. And it wasn't just the visits. Walter had once spotted Daniel standing behind the garage in the dark, unmoving, for nearly 15 minutes, staring at nothing. Claire met Walter by accident on a windy afternoon while walking her dog. They struck up a casual chat about the changing leaves, the potholes the town refused to fix, and eventually Walter brought up the garage. "You're Claire, right? Related to the Miller boys?" Claire blinked, nodded. "Jacob's my cousin." She hesitated. "Not really. Not anymore." Walter pursed his lips. "That garage. He's in and out at hours that make no sense." Claire tilted her head. "You've seen him?" "Several times," Walter replied calmly. "Always alone. Never stays long. Never turns on the main lights. Not once." A chill ran up her spine. That night Claire sat in her car, down the block from the garage, her engine off, windows cracked. The street lamp flickered twice, then steadied. At 12:30 a.m., Daniel's truck turned the corner. He parked, cut the engine, stepped out. His motions were careful, rehearsed. He looked around, but not up. Claire held her breath as he vanished into the garage. The door closed, the light above the red steel door flickered on. Then silence. Walter Green had lived through mortar shells and midnight raids, and yet what kept him awake in Woodpine now wasn't war, it was rhythm. He first noticed it on a Tuesday night, a little after 1:00 a.m., the same time Daniel's truck had pulled away from Miller's auto in the usual hush. Walter was closing the blinds in his kitchen when he paused, ears sharpening at an odd sound. It was subtle, faint, but unmistakably deliberate. A thud, slight pause, another thud, same cadence, same pressure, like something or someone hitting from beneath a slab of earth. The sound came from the general direction of the shop's rear, near the old storage unit that sat low and hunched behind the main garage, a part of the property few ever mentioned and none seemed to use. He chalked it up to an animal, maybe an opossum. But the next Tuesday, the same time, same sound, 3 thuds. Steady, measured, followed by silence thick enough to make the air in his lungs stall. He didn't mention it to Claire right away. Not yet. She had looked tense the last time they spoke, eyes darting as if piecing together invisible threads. Instead, Walter pulled out an old field notebook, one he hadn't used since his days documenting border patrols overseas, and wrote, "Tuesday, 1:12 a.m., Thud X3. Source, a directional, approximately 9 seconds. The following week it happened again. Always Tuesday, always past 1:00 a.m., always 3 hits, never more, never less." This time he stepped out onto his porch and strained his ears. He caught it again, more clearly now, thud, 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 then nothing but crickets and the distant hum of a fridge motor from someone's back porch. It was not natural. Walter knew pattern, and this was pattern with intent. That Thursday he walked slowly to the edge of his property at dusk, paused near the old dogwood tree that offered precious cover, and watched Daniel's garage as if expecting it to blink. The red steel door glinted under the porch light. Nothing moved, yet the quiet was never truly still anymore. Something breathed beneath that concrete. By Friday, Walter had made up his mind. He retrieved a compact digital audio recorder, the kind sold for lectures and interviews, and rigged it inside a weatherproof box from his shed. At 11:45 p.m., he slipped through the alley behind his home and crossed over into the edge of Daniel's fence line. The rear of the garage had no motion lights, and the only camera, if any existed, faced the front. Walter found a small crevice between 2 stacked crates near the back door and secured the recorder there, angled toward the base of the wall, microphone facing the cement floor. He timed it so that it would record from midnight to 2:30 EEMN. The next morning he retrieved it as the sun cracked over the horizon, heart pulsing, unsure whether he wanted to hear what might be captured. Back inside, he poured coffee with trembling fingers and sat at his desk. The first 45 minutes were silence and ambient noise, crickets, a soft breeze, the occasional passing car. Then, at exactly 1:13 IMM, a sound emerged. 3 knocks. Not random, not mechanical. The space between each was identical. 3 distinct, flesh-on-nettle strikes, a pause of 10 seconds, then another series. This repeated 6 times over the next hour. No speech, no background movement, just the repeated message in a language built from urgency. Walter leaned back, stunned, chilled. He played the section again. The knocks were coming from inside, from under, from something or someone intentionally signaling through layers of cement and time. By the sixth day of recordings, the same pattern persisted. Every night the three knocks returned. Always same time, same rhythm. On the fourth night, a low moan followed the second knock sequence. Short, distorted, but unmistakably human. Walter didn't sleep that night. He went back to previous week's notes and realized this pattern had started months ago, only now he had proof. He began comparing the knock timings with Daniel's comings and goings, matching entries. The overlap was near perfect. Daniel would leave, and within minutes, the knocks would begin. The cause and effect couldn't be clearer. He debated calling Claire, then hesitated. She deserved to know, yes, but he needed more. He needed to be sure before dragging someone else into this darkness. So he returned to the alley 2 nights later and moved the recorder even closer, positioning it directly behind a vent pipe protruding from the ground behind the structure. It seemed harmless enough, but something about that pipe felt too well placed, too deliberately obscured behind overgrown ivy. That night, the knocks came again, louder, as if the microphone's position had brought it closer to the source. The recorder also picked up something new, scraping, like nails against a rough surface, desperate, erratic. Walter listened, alone, in the pre-dawn hours, his hand clenched around the coffee mug. There was someone down there. Not something. Someone. And that someone had been trying to be heard. The patterns were not an accident. They were a signal. Walter walked into the Woodpine Police Department just past noon, the digital recorder clutched tightly in his hand, its battery long drained, but its memory card loaded with truths no one wanted to imagine. The receptionist, a young man in his early 20s, offered a polite but disinterested smile as he gestured toward the front desk, where 2 senior officers stood chatting over coffee. Walter cleared his throat, firm and steady, announcing that he had evidence of possible criminal activity involving one Daniel Miller. One of the officers, Detective Huntley, badge hanging low and tired eyes peering over his bifocals, gave him a once-over and chuckled under his breath. "Mr. Green, right? The guy from Maple Street. You filed a noise complaint last year about squirrels in the attic." Walter's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure, stating that this was different, that he had 6 nights' worth of recordings, all identical, capturing human-like knocking from beneath a concrete floor at Miller's Auto. Huntley raised an eyebrow, exchanged a look with the other officer, and said, "You're sure it's not the pipes, sir? We've had a few reports about old plumbing around that neighborhood." Walter opened the audio file on his phone. He had transferred the sound for ease and played the clearest sample. The 3 thuds echoed through the small lobby, crisp and disturbingly measured. Still, the response was a faint shrug. "We'll make a note," Huntley said, "but unless you've got more than spooky noises, there's not much we can do. People hear things, especially, well, when they get up in the east." The implication stung more than Walter expected. He stood silent for a beat, then turned and walked out, his shoulders squared not in defeat, but in rising resolve. What he didn't see, however, was Officer Karen Wells, a recent academy graduate signed to clerical duties, sitting behind the glass partition near the corner, her expression frozen in thought. She had overheard the exchange, heard the knocks too, and something in her gut told her those weren't just echoes. Later that evening, as the department lights dimmed and the shift changed over, Karen found Walter's name in the daily log and accessed the audio file he had left behind on the shared drive. She played it over and over, head tilted, trying to make sense of the sequence. 3 knocks, exactly 12 seconds apart, repeated, and then that faint groan at the end, unmistakably human. She searched Daniel Miller's address, then checked the town registry. His garage had passed inspection 2 years ago, but she noticed something odd. A permit had been filed a decade earlier to renovate an underground inspection trench, but the description was vague, the blueprints never uploaded. Karen requested a copy and was told it was lost during a digital migration. That alone made her eyebrows rise. She decided to drive by the shop after her shift, not to interfere, just to observe. But fate, as it often does, made other plans. Daniel's truck was gone when she arrived, the lot empty save for a few rusting tire rims stacked near the office entrance. She parked discreetly down the block and walked the perimeter, scanning casually with her flashlight. Behind the main garage was a side unit with faded signage and an uneven concrete pad that looked more weathered than the rest. She knelt down near the edge of the pad, brushing dust and dirt away, and that's when she saw it, a patch of concrete that didn't match. It was subtle, but under her light it stood out clearly. A numer pour, slightly lighter in hue, its surface less weathered, almost smooth compared to the cracked texture surrounding it. She tapped it lightly. It echoed differently. She froze. That wasn't just patchwork, it was a seal, a cover. Karen took out her phone, snapped a few photos, then reached into her back pocket for a plastic ruler. She measured the outline roughly just under 5 feet by 3. Too small for a typical car inspection pit. She stood, heart racing, and turned her gaze to the old vent pipe nearby. It had no connection to anything above ground. A fake ventilation system, she suspected. Suddenly, everything Walter said clicked into place. The knocks, the timing, the pattern. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked around, ensuring no one had seen her. She returned to her car quickly but calmly, mind spinning with what this meant. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her report wouldn't be believed without more, not with no warrant, no witness, and no body. But something was down there, something or someone would listen. Karen knew she had crossed an invisible line. She wasn't supposed to be there, and technically she had nothing yet, but she also knew that if she turned away now, she'd be letting silence win. So she printed the photos, labeled them, and prepared to return. The search warrant came through 48 hours later, and by that point, Officer Karen Wells had barely slept. Her photographs, cross-referenced with county renovation records, were enough to convince the assistant district attorney to approve limited access to the garage for further inspection. Daniel Miller was conveniently absent, called away to a supplier conference in Northridge, and that allowed the team to move quickly and quietly. Early that morning, a small task force of uniformed officers and 2 detectives arrived at the scene, equipment in hand, flanked by a concrete specialist contracted for the job. Karen stood to the side, heart thudding, as they cordoned off the back section of the garage. The specialist ran a density scan over the unusual slab, confirming what Karen had suspected. Beneath the lighter patch of concrete was an air gap roughly 4 feet deep. "Something's hollow down there," he announced, and the lead detective nodded. They brought out the jackhammers. The sound of cement breaking apart under steel teeth filled the air like thunder. Dust billowed, and, with each inch revealed, the shape of something man-made took form, a rectangular outline with sharp corners. Then metal. The tool struck with a loud ping, and Karen stepped closer. They brushed away the last chunks of rubble, exposing what appeared to be a heavy iron hatch. It was industrial in style, painted over and partially corroded at the seam. There were weld lines, thick, crude, definitive. Someone had sealed it from above. One of the officers knelt beside it, tested the perimeter with a crowbar, but the welds held firm. "We'll need to cut it," he said, and a second team was called in with an angle grinder. Sparks flew for the next 20 minutes as steel groaned under pressure. Finally, with a hiss and a metallic shriek, the last segment gave way and the hatch was pried open. What followed was a moment of suspended silence. A rancid breath of air exhaled from the darkness below, stale, heavy, and faintly chemical. Karen's stomach turned. The detective clicked on his flashlight and pointed it into the void. A ladder, rusted but intact, descended into pitch blackness. "You ready?" he asked, and Karen nodded. She descended first, boots landing on compact dirt after roughly 10 rungs. Her beam swept across the hidden space, and what she saw made her freeze. The underground room was about 8 by 10 feet, claustrophobic in every direction. The walls were lined with old bricks, blackened with time and moisture. A single cot sat in the corner, sagging under its own weight, the mattress stained and frayed. Plastic containers were stacked haphazardly, stack saint down from above, likely part of the fake vent they'd seen on the surface. And there, huddled against the far wall, was a man. He didn't react to the light, didn't flinch or speak. His body was gaunt, skeletal beneath oversized rags that barely clung to him. His hair was long, tangled into mats, and his beard hung like rope. His skin, once fair, had a sickly pallor, and his eyes, when they finally met Karen's, were bloodshot, confused, and almost vacant. She approached slowly, heart pounding, and knelt a few feet away. "Sir?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Can you hear me?" The man blinked. He opened his mouth but only managed a croak. She repeated herself, softer this time, and he nodded faintly. The radio crackled above. "Karen, what do you see?" She pressed the button, her voice firm. "There's someone down here, male, mid-40s to early 50s, severely malnourished." The silence that followed her transmission was deafening. Then came the scramble, calls for EMTs, forensics, backup. But down in the cramped pit, time moved differently. Karen remained with him, offering water from her canteen, which he sipped with trembling hands. She gently asked for his name. He looked at her, tears pooling, then murmured hoarsely, "Jacob. Jacob Miller." She nearly dropped the bottle. That name hadn't spoken in town for over 17 years, not since he'd vanished without a trace, presumed dead or long gone. Karen sat back, stunned. The story of the Miller brothers had been local lore for so long that most believed Jacob had simply fled. But here he was, grieving, broken, and barely human after nearly 2 decades buried alive beneath the garage he once co-owned. Paramedics arrived minutes later and lowered a stretcher. It took both Karen and the medics to help Jacob onto it, his body too weak to move alone. As they ascended, the light from the surface hit him for the first time in what was likely years. He winced, groaned, and covered his eyes. Karen followed closely, never taking her eyes off him. The moment they emerged, officers began roping off the entire property. Reporters hadn't arrived yet, but they would. This was too big, too monstrous to stay quiet. As Jacob was placed into the ambulance, Karen stayed behind, hands trembling. She looked once more into the hatch, then up at the building surrounding it. Daniel had built a prison beneath his own garage and had walked over it every day like nothing had happened. Jacob hadn't spoken again, not beyond his name, but the truth was written across every inch of his frail frame. He hadn't disappeared by choice. He hadn't run. He had been hidden. The sirens had faded into the distance, taking Jacob Miller to the county hospital, but the echo of his voice remained behind, like a ghost that wouldn't leave. Karen Wells stood by the open hatch, her mind reeling, as a paramedic who had just helped carry Jacob up leaned toward her and whispered. He kept mumbling something, same phrase, over and over. Karen turned, eyes narrowing what to say. The medic hesitated, then replied, "Don't lock it again. Danny, don't lock it again." Just that, like it was the only sentence he remembered. The word sent a chill spiraling through Karen's spine. She scribbled it in her notebook, heart hammering. Danny Daniel. He wasn't just Jacob's brother, he was his warden. The manhunt didn't take long. Daniel Miller had checked into a hotel in Northridge under his own name, apparently confident that whatever secret lay buried in the garage would remain undisturbed. When officers entered his room just past midnight, he didn't resist. Didn't even ask why. Just sat at the edge of the bed, eyes glazed, fingers trembling, and quietly submitted as they cuffed him. By sunrise, he was back in Woodpine, locked in a small interrogation room lined with beige walls and a humming fluorescent light that flickered every 11 seconds. He stared at the metal table in front of him as if it were familiar. Detective Huntley, suddenly very serious now that the noise complaint had turned into a national headline, walked in with Karen Wells beside him. They brought a stack of documents, photographs from the hatch, the audio recordings, and, most damning of all, a printout of Jacob's hospital intake sheet, confirming identity through dental records. The detective dropped the stack on the table, let the silence stretch like wire, then asked, "Is there anything you want to tell us before we begin?" Daniel blinked slowly, then looked at Karen. He asked, his voice raw and unfamiliar, like it hadn't been used honestly in years. Karen nodded. "Barely, but yes, he's alive." Daniel didn't speak for a long while. He kept looking down at his hands, still stained faintly with oil from the garage, then finally sighed. "I never meant for it to go that long." Karen frowned. "What do you mean?" He swallowed hard, a muscle twitching in his jaw. It was supposed to be a few days, a scare, just enough to teach him a lesson. Huntley leaned forward. "A lesson? You sealed your brother in a hole under concrete for 17 years. Daniel's voice cracked. He was going to sell the garage, our garage, said he had an offer from a developer in Eugene, some franchise chain, didn't even tell me, just dropped it on me one day like it didn't mean anything. Like what we built wasn't worth a damn. His fists clenched. I gave up college for that place, gave up moving away, building something of my own. He was going to erase it all and move to Arizona with Claire and pretend none of it mattered. Karen's voice was tight. So you locked him in the inspection pit? Just like that? Daniel shook his head violently. No, it wasn't like that. We argued. It got physical. He fell, hit his head. Not hard, just enough to be out cold. I panicked. I dragged him down there to cool off. Thought I'd scare him into realizing what he was throwing away. He buried his face in his hands. I brought food the next morning, water. He was furious, said he was calling the cops when he got out, said I was finished. I told him I'd let him out the next day. He looked up slowly, hollow. But I didn't. The next day I couldn't. I told myself he needed more time to think. Then more. Then it was a week. Then 2. Hantley interrupted. You welded the hatch shut. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Was afraid. Afraid he'd go to the police. Afraid I'd lose the garage. Afraid everyone would see me as the brother who snapped. So I started bringing food through the pipe. Set up the ventilation. I cleaned the place up. Made it livable. I even put an insulation down there, but after a while he stopped talking to me. Then he stopped looking at me altogether. I thought he'd go crazy. Then I thought maybe he had, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't undo it. Every year that passed made it harder. I sent those postcards to keep Claire from digging too deep. I even copied his old letters to make them look real. You faked his handwriting? Daniel nodded. I practiced for weeks, used old receipts, every detail. He laughed bitterly. He always had that stupid loop on his J. Took me months to get it right. The room was silent except for the fluorescent hum. Karen leaned back, eyes burning. You didn't just lock him away. You erased him. Daniel didn't argue. He simply nodded. I know. As the investigation widened, Woodpine awoke to a storm of headlines and whispers, its quiet streets flooded with media vans and curious strangers trying to make sense of a story too horrifying to accept. While Jacob recovered slowly, in a secured hospital ward, nursed back to life with cautious care and guarded silence, detectives combed through Miller's auto inch by inch, every corner now a potential crime scene. It was Officer Karen Wells who uncovered the next layer of deception, a discovery that would drag Daniel Miller's name from cold-hearted sibling to compulsive manipulator. While reviewing evidence at the precinct, she received a call from a forensics tech working in the garage. His voice was tight. You might want to come see this. Back at the garage, under the harsh glow of halogen lamps, the technician led her to the far storage corner, where Daniel had kept rows of old engine parts and dusty shelving units stacked with empty containers. One shelf had a false backing, a slim panel that clicked loose with gentle pressure. Inside was a narrow compartment containing a shoebox. Karen opened it and found postcards, dozens of them, some blank, some already written, all in the same forced slanted handwriting that mimicked Jacob's, with eerie precision. More troubling, nestled among the cards, were rubber postal stamps with old city names, Amarillo, Boise, Helena, even places Jacob had never once mentioned visiting. Alongside them were dated ink pads, neatly labeled and still moist. They're not real mail, the tech explained. He stamped them himself. Probably used these to fake travel, make it look like Jacob was sending updates from the road. Karen's throat tightened. The deception had been calculated, curated, with a collector's precision. Daniel had used stamps sourced from antique shops and flea markets, each one tied to decades past, repurposed to paint the illusion of a wandering brother. It was psychological theater, staged by a man who knew every emotional button to press. But the worst was yet to come. When the text began dismantling the insulation along the garage's rear interior wall near the hidden hatch, they found what looked like ordinary electrical wiring at first, threaded through PVC pipe. Upon further inspection, they realized the wires led not to lighting fixtures, but to small, rounded lenses embedded in the drywall. Cameras, at least 3, concealed expertly behind air vents and a broken thermostat casing. Karen traced the wires to a locked panel behind Daniel's old workbench, where a compact DVR system sat humming silently, its hard drive filled to capacity. When the footage was recovered, the truth became unbearable. For years, Daniel had been watching, not from outside, not sporadically, but systematically, hours of video showing Jacob's every move within the bunker. He'd installed the cameras before sealing the hatch, a predator ensuring the prey remained visible. Karen watched in horror as the earliest recordings showed Jacob pacing the small room, shouting at the ceiling, throwing tin cans in rage. As time passed, the videos became quieter, Jacob's posture more hunched, his eyes less focused. In one clip from 2009, he simply stared into the middle distance for nearly an hour, not blinking, his fingers twitching against the cot's edge. Another showed him scratching tally marks on the wall with a nail, only to cry silently when he miscounted. Each video was dated, catalogued, and labeled: Week 42 to silent, Year 4 attempted scream, Year 9 collapse near vent. The labels were cold, clinical. Karen had to leave the room halfway through the second clip. She vomited in the alley behind the building. The footage, once processed, became the prosecution's crown jewel, proof not just of physical imprisonment, but psychological torture that spanned nearly 2 decades. Experts confirmed that the monitoring wasn't passive. Daniel had placed a speaker system into the ventilation pipe, one he used to occasionally speak to Jacob. Recordings on the hard drive showed that he would say things like, "You brought this on yourself?" and "You will come out when you're ready to change." Karen wondered what kind of man watched his brother deteriorate through a lens and still convinced himself it was righteous punishment. Daniel, when confronted with the evidence, didn't deny it. Instead, he explained, "I needed to make sure he didn't hurt himself. I needed to monitor him, keep him stable." He said it as if he were a caretaker, not a captor. "I told him I'd let him out, he just never said he was ready." The court psychiatrist later suggested Daniel suffered from a rare combination of delusional justification and obsessive control behavior, unable to distinguish between punishment and preservation. But to Karen, it sounded like something simpler: cruelty disguised as logic. As she couldn't stop thinking about those early postcards, how they had given Claire hope, how they had stalled real suspicion for years. Daniel hadn't just locked Jacob away. He had built a believable alternate reality, one where Jacob was always just out of reach, always moving, always fine. The trial of Daniel Miller drew national attention, transforming the quiet courtroom in Woodpine County into a place of daily pilgrimage for journalists, advocates, and stunned locals who had once regarded the Miller brothers as nothing more than 2 dependable men running a family garage. On the stand, Jacob appeared only once, wheeled into the room by a nurse, eyes shaded under a thin blue cap, his frame still recovering from decades of starvation. He did not speak to the court, his doctors advised against it, but when asked if he had anything to show, he quietly handed over a folded slip of paper to the bailiff, who then delivered it to the judge. Inside were 5 photographs, each taken by police of the back wall of his underground cell. On those bricks, worn smooth in some areas, were tens of thousands of hash marks, carved crudely by hand, 3 vertical slashes crossed by a diagonal, the universal symbol for counting. Some had been made with nails, others with screws and rusted bolts from torn ventilation grates, each mark painstakingly etched in the same tight space, over and over. Forensic analysts counted them one by one and confirmed 9,493 separate marks. 26 years, counted day by day in a tomb no wider than a prison cell. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as the judge reviewed the photos. Karen Wells, seated just behind the prosecution team, had seen the real wall during her return visit to the crime scene. She had stood there, gloved hand tracing over rows of faintly red markings, imagining Jacob pressing himself against that cold wall each night, trying to hold on to time in a place designed to steal it. There were no decorations in that room, no calendars or clocks, only the wall and the rhythm of hunger and noise, of Daniel's voice overhead, sometimes cruel, sometimes eerily calm. That wall had been Jacob's only tether to reality, and it told a story more powerful than anything he could say aloud. Daniel sat motionless at the defendant's table, face thinner than weeks before, his suit oversized and loose. His lawyer, a state-appointed defender, had done what he could, pleading diminished capacity, psychological trauma, citing Daniel's lifelong anxiety, his fear of abandonment, his obsessive tendencies toward control. But none of it softened the blow of the videos, the forged postcards, the fake stamps, the camera angles cataloging Jacob's descent into something less than human. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When the foreman stood and read the verdict, guilty on all counts, including attempted murder, unlawful imprisonment, aggravated torture, Daniel showed no emotion. The judge asked if the defendant had anything to say before sentencing. Daniel stood slowly, his voice surprisingly clear as he looked across the room, not at Jacob, not at the jury, but straight ahead, like speaking to an invisible figure in the back. "I just wanted to keep the legacy," he said. "He was going to erase me." His words hung in the air, heavy and hollow. "I gave everything for that garage, my 20s, my family." He never asked, just decided. That place was all I had. His voice cracked slightly, but no tears came. He was going to sell it, take the money, and leave. No goodbye, no compromise. I didn't mean for it to last. I just wanted time. He never forgave me for needing more time. The judge leaned forward. "You will spend the remainder of your life in state prison, Mr. Miller." Without the possibility of parole, the gavel struck once, sharp and final. The courtroom exhaled. Outside, Claire waited by the courthouse steps, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers for Jacob, unsure if they would mean anything now. She remembered riding bikes with the two brothers down Main Street when they were kids, watching them throw footballs in the park, helping them repaint the garage sign when they took it over from their father. All of it felt like fiction now, a life rewritten by a lie so deep it buried one man and nearly destroyed another. Karen exited a few minutes later, nodding silently as their eyes met. There was nothing more to say. Jacob returned to Claire's home temporarily, his care managed by a team of therapists and trauma specialists. He spoke little but started drawing again, simple sketches at first, gears, wrenches, cars, hands. His hands, Claire found him one afternoon in the garden, gently tracing the grooves on a tree trunk, whispering numbers to himself. She didn't interrupt. A month later, the red steel door at Miller's Auto was removed entirely. The hatch beneath it was sealed for good. No marker was placed, no plaque. The town voted to tear down the garage altogether. In its place would be a community garden, something green, something honest. No one spoke Daniel's name after the first frost. If this story left you speechless, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the mystery what Officer Karen did. And where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment, we'd love to know.